Alright you guys, as you can see by the thumbnail, I'm back with another one like the other one. So check it out you guys, I got another banger for you. And like the last couple of videos that I put out, this one's also coming from the LA County Jail. But before I get into this story, let me just update those of you who have become Chewy fans since he started his struggle with being a diabetic. You know, unfortunately, I haven't been able to work on any of these stories for you guys up until today, which is Tuesday, September 30th, due to Chewy's health taking a turn for the worse. You know, I'll spare some of you the details, but just trust me, it's been a rough week. Things ended up getting so bad that I actually thought I was gonna lose him again. But this guy's a trooper and he keeps fighting. So after a number of trips to the emergency vet and after watching them run a series of tests and watching them poke and cut on him, he ended up pulling through at the last minute. And I'm talking about at the very last minute when I thought that dreadful time had come. You know, it was in the middle of the night and I was literally within minutes of taking him back to the vet. I got dressed, locked up the house, was getting ready to go, and he either sensed it or this guy heard me on the phone talking to the vet, because at the very last minute, he pulled through and showed some interest in starting to eat again. You know, if you guys know anything about dogs being diabetics, if they stop eating, that puts them in the danger zone and they go in a diabetic shock. And that's where we were at. But the important thing is that he's all good now. And after maxing out my credit cards again on vet bills, after I was in recovery mode, his insulin's regulated, he showed some interest in eating again, and he's back to his rambunctious self. So once again, I dodged the bullet. I'm thankful that he's still here. And like I said, it's just been a rough week. But anyways, with regards to this story, during the time when this incident took place, Joseph Cisneros, Jojo from Big Hazard, and Richard Trujillo, Gato from Eastside Longo, were neighbors in 1750. And the reason why they were housed in 1750 was based solely on them both being validated associates of the Mexican Mafia. And I'm not going to get too deep in all the technical legalities of it, but it's very common for county jail gang intel units and classification units to honor when CDCRs validated certain inmates as being affiliated with a specific gang or group. Especially a county jail like the LA County Jail works hand in hand with Operation Safe Jails, a specialized anti-gang unit that controls, investigates, and manages gang members in a number of different county jails. You know, I'm not sure how things are now since all the changes were made to CDCR's policy on gang validation and the indie tournament shoot programs, but I know when I was doing time, I got slammed down at every county jail I went to with the exception of Santa Rita. And Santa Rita just let me slip through despite knowing that I was validated. For those of you that aren't familiar with some of the old validation policies, this is how it worked in short order. So validation was basically a 3-point system that was used to document gang members and associates to one of California's Big Four. And then later, they also used it to validate certain individuals who they identified as being affiliated with a number of different disruptive groups. And this was all instituted through a process. So in order for them to validate you, this required 3 independent sources that provided a direct link to either one of CDCR's criminal organizations, being an associate, or an actual member. In Jojo and Gato's case, it was obviously the Mexican Mafia. Some of the potential sources that they used were tattoos, written material, drawings, and then what they also determined met the criteria of self-admission. And this was done through them monitoring phone calls and screening both incoming and outgoing mail, where they would listen for you to either claim membership or make reference to being affiliated with one of these criminal organizations. Then there was another process where they had to continue updating your gang file in order to keep you active. Otherwise, if you went dormant for a period of time, they had to consider your gang standings as being stale, which under their own criteria basically meant that you weren't active. Not in a literal sense, figuratively speaking, but it was only done for the purpose of their own system. So initially, Jojo was validated in Folsom State Prison back in 1993. And then later, during a review, he was revalidated again in 2000 at Tehachapi State Prison. So the gang intel unit at the LA County Jail was well aware of Jojo's status as an active gang member, and they had dealt with him before many times in the past. He was a frequent flyer. Later in January of 2007, he was awaiting trial following allegations on crimes relating to Mexican Mafia business. And then through Jojo's own interaction and how he moved at the LA County Jail, he had developed a reputation over time for being a leader on Denver Road, or as Operation Safe Jail had classified him as a shot caller. And apparently this was all documented and reinforced by several of the deputies that were Denver Row in 1750. They indicated that Jojo had a lot of respect and that he was the representative that made all the decisions for Denver Row. You know, I don't want to get off track, but I talked about this before in the past, and I think it's important to clarify this. Because when we're housed on a tier like this, whether it's a module, a tier, or a block, or whatever it is, if you're part of the leadership, then you're going to establish some type of understanding or rapport with the deputies or the COs that work in your area, and those are facts. Whether it's done by design or default, it's gonna happen, because the same way we watch them to generate a mental profile on how they operate, just so we know who and what we're dealing with, they do the same thing with the inmates. They watch the inmates to see how they interact, who's always in the mix, who's the go-to guy on the tier, and just other things that they can see through the course of common observation. Because at least in my experience, most of the time, these officers that work on these types of tiers and in these types of environments usually want to run a trouble-free program without any problems. You know, you're always going to have your occasional assholes who like to stay wound up and who don't mind dying 5 years after retirement because of the stress. But for the most part, most of these guys just like to come to work, put in their 8 or 12 hours and go home. And if there ever is any problems, they like to know who they can go to fix it or to remedy whatever it is that's going on. And according to my source and everything I've been able to gather, Jojo was the one that fit this bill. For example, one of the deputies that would later testify in a criminal case that stemmed from this story, and according to my source and everything I've been able to gather, Jojo's the one that fit this bill. For example, one of the deputies that would later testify in a criminal case that stemmed from this story would later testify that Jojo had authority over all the inmates on Denver Road, and that they basically have to get permission from him for anything that they wanted to do. This particular deputy determined this based on some of the interaction that he's seen himself. One example he gave was that whenever an inmate was asked if he wanted to go somewhere, like medical, dental, or some other type of interview, instead of that inmate answering the deputy himself, he would call down to Jojo and ask him if it was okay to go. And then when Jojo would tell him that it was okay to go, then they tell the deputy that they wanted to go. Trust me, the deputies, they're always watching for things like this. And again, it's so that they know who's doing what, and just so that they could be aware of their own surroundings. Other examples this deputy gave consisted of the following. This deputy said that Jojo would be the one who would decide whether the row would have the TV on or off. He would also be the one to decide whether the inmates will come out for showers or abide by the rules. If the noise level got too loud on Denver Road, one of the deputies would call down to Jojo and tell him, "Hey Jojo, it's getting a little loud and my sergeant's starting to sweat me." If Jojo said okay, then the noise level would instantly go down and there would be no more problems. But again, Jojo's serving a bigger purpose and he's doing what he's supposed to do. But as you guys will see from listening to this story, these deputies are taking notes, and this type of interaction actually ended up working against him. You know, again, this same deputy reiterated that it was a common occurrence for any inmate that was getting ready to leave the unit to call down to Jojo by saying, "Hey camarada, hey, is it okay if I go?" Then they wait for Jojo to respond, and once Jojo gave him a thumbs up or a thumbs down, they'd either go or they stay. You know, on a side note, I clearly understand the reasons why these guys had to seek clearance from Jojo before agreeing to go on any off-tier movement. But at the same time, this also fronted Jojo off, and like I said, later on, this would all end up working against him. You know, it basically confirms to these deputies that he's the leader in that module and that he has some type of status. So this same deputy that testified later in the criminal case described Jojo as running a very orderly role, as being very strict, very quiet, very disciplined, but also someone who had a lot of respect. He went on to say that Jojo got along with all the staff at the jail and that he had the ability to keep the rest of the inmates in line and act accordingly. You know, as far as Gato's validation history, when he got validated or anything along those lines, not a whole lot was really said about him. But when it came to describing Gato's character and why it was relevant to this criminal case, Gato was described as being brash, a little cocky, and that at times he had an attitude with a chip on his shoulder. The same deputy said that at times, Gato was always confrontational and controversial. That the other inmates would go along with the program and follow his directives, but that Gato was always challenging everything and that he wasn't really respected by the rest of the inmates on Denver Road. Well, let me clarify that. They had to respect him because he was designated as being one of their leaders. So they had to respect him. But there's a big difference when a leader is respected merely out of obligation opposed to being respected because of the way he inspires and leads. The other inmates on Denver Road respected Jojo because of the way he conducted himself as a professional and because of the way he carried himself as a leader. With Gato, it was only out of obligation, so there's a very big difference. You know, just based on what this deputy said himself, he confirms it. It sounds like Jojo and Gato both had some type of influence on Denver Road, and that they were both recognized as being leaders. And that out of the two, Jojo seemed to be the more level-headed and respected one. Gato, on the other hand, was looked at as a hothead, someone who wasn't approachable and who probably had a style of leading that was based on fear and intimidation, or someone who was probably on a power trip. You know, on a side note, I'm not exactly sure where Michael Torres Mosca from San Fer was housed in the county jail at the time of this incident, but he was definitely there. There was also some indication that Daniel Grajeda Cuate from La Rana was also somewhere there in the jail. Don't quote me on this, but if Cuate wasn't in fact there, then he was tied into this story as either having influence or possibly being a contact of either Jojo's or Gato's. You know, I'll get back to this later, but Mosca was definitely there, and he's the one that gave Jojo his wings. He's the one that gave him the authority to run Denver Road in 1750. You know, I know that both Mosca and Cuate spent a significant amount of time in the LA County Jail between the late 90s and the early 2000s. In fact, I ran several stories on them both while they were there. These are just a few that I ran. You should be looking at some of the thumbnails right now. I even ran the story detailing the circumstances behind Mosca's demise, as well as how Cuate and his two brothers all ended up in bad standings. Anyways, I'm going to take you guys back to 2007 when this incident took place. And again, like a lot of the stories that I've told you guys about before in the past, this story took place in 1750. Which is considered to be one of the maximum security tiers in the LA County Jail. So on January 12, 2007, at about 5:50 p.m., one of the deputies that worked in 1750, Deputy Love, was conducting a routine security check on Denver Road. This is basically when the deputy that's working that tier will either come in and perform his routine count or his routine welfare checks. The underlying purpose for this is to make sure that all the inmates are alive and breathing, that they're all in their assigned cells, and that nothing's out of order. You know, usually if a deputy's cool and he really ain't sweating the small stuff, he'll just come in real quick, do a quick walk, and then he'll be out of there. But if he's a RoboCop, the kind that irons his uniform every morning, shines his boots, and puts his gold cufflinks on before he goes to work, then he's someone that takes his job way too serious. He's someone that goes above and beyond what it takes to catch someone breaking the rules. Coming on the tier with his nostrils on high beam mode, trying to smell for cigarette smoke, or trying to catch someone going up on a batch of wine. And trust me, you always encounter these types of guys who go to work for no other purpose other than to shit on someone's day. You know, but in these types of environments, the inmates, they usually know when these walks are coming. They anticipate them. And when an officer does come on the tier, the inmates will usually initiate some type of security caveat verbally to let the rest of the inmates know that a deputy has entered the unit. You know, some of the tiers that I've been on that are similar to 1750, I've heard them all. I've heard everything from hot water on deck, kukui from front to back, one time, 501 line, night rider on 5, etc., etc. You know, those are just a few, but again, it's basically just to let everyone know on the tier to secure your contraband and to be on your toes, that a deputy has entered the unit. So when this deputy started to do his walk in 1750, according to him, he could tell that the inmates on Denver Road had been drinking based on the fact that there was a strong smell of alcohol that was emanating from the entire tier. Furthermore, he said that he knew there was some kind of problem on the tier because as he was walking the tier, all the inmates were in the back of their cells, and this was highly unusual. According to him and his experience, when he's seen inmates do this before in the past as a collective, he knew that something was either about to happen or that something had already happened. So as this deputy continued to make his way down the tier, he said when he got to cell 14 that he noticed that the inmate that was in that cell looked like he was scared, like he was frightened, that something had happened and that he didn't want to be a part of it. You know, it sounds like this guy either didn't know how to hide his facial expressions or he was just dry snitching. He was trying to tell the deputy that something had happened. But either way, Deputy Love said that the tier was extremely quiet, and that's something else that stood out to him. And Deputy Love actually made a good point. He said normally under any other circumstances that this wouldn't have raised red flags, but that in an environment like this, you have quiet and then there's quiet. It's a different kind of quiet. The kind of quiet that lets you know that something just happened or something's about to happen. Like when someone's about to get hit, it gets real quiet and you can feel the vibe in the air. That's the same kind of quiet he was talking about. So when he got to the next cell, cell 13, which was Gato's cell, Gato had a sheet hanging up over the front of the cell. And the sheet covered the full length of the cell. So you couldn't see him behind the sheet. You could see his silhouette and him standing behind it, but you couldn't see him. And again, under normal circumstances, this wouldn't have raised any suspicion either, because inmates normally hang up sheets whenever they want privacy. Whenever they take a bird bath or use the bathroom, they'll hang up a sheet. Everybody uses these types of curtains. It's just a normal part of living in a cell like this. But what caught Deputy Love's attention is that there appeared to be blood and water all over Gato's floor, as if he was either cleaning up blood or possibly doing something to hurt himself. When Deputy Love peeked around the corner of the sheet, he said that he seen Gato standing at the sink and that he appeared to be frantic. He was trying to wash his arm and clean up the blood. And Deputy Love said there was blood everywhere. It was all over the walls, all over the floor, all over the sink, and it was all over a pile of towels that he had thrown in the corner. You know, the other thing that was throwing Deputy Love off as he was looking in Gato's cell is that whenever an inmate is in any type of medical distress on the tier, the other inmates will start yelling "man down." You know, it's almost like an unwritten rule amongst the inmates that this is what they're supposed to do when someone goes down and there's some type of medical emergency on the tier. The only exception is when it's somebody that's been X'd out or somebody that they don't want to help. So the fact that none of the other inmates called out "man down" for Gato was something that Deputy Love was trying to process in his mind as he was looking around in Gato's cell. The other thing that was throwing him off is that the inmates that are housed in 1750 aren't the type of inmates that you would find cutting on themselves or acting like J-Cats. They're stand-up dudes. They carry themselves with a level of respect. So none of this was adding up. So at that point, Deputy Love called out to two other deputies that were up front that were also working 1750, Deputy Martinez and Deputy Clift. When they got to Gato's cell, they said that it looked like something out of a movie, that it looked like a crime scene. There was blood everywhere, and that Gato was standing there with two deep lacerations on his arm. They said he was bleeding profusely. One of the lacerations was described as being about 5 inches long and at least an inch deep. So deep that Gato's tendons were visible to the naked eye. But later on, when Deputy Love would testify, he said there was something about the look in Gato's eyes. It was fear. It was almost a look like he didn't want to be involved and that he didn't want no part of it. You know, keep in mind that this particular deputy, Deputy Love, had worked back there in 1750 at that point for 4 years. So he had some experience under his belt. So you could say he was well versed when it came to some of the tier's characteristics and the inner workings of how these guys normally operated. And although none of it was making sense, he was starting to see red flags everywhere. And at that point, regardless of what was at play here, he knew that he wasn't going to get any cooperation on the tier. Not from these guys, and even if they wanted to talk, they wouldn't talk out of fear. He described Gato at that point as being very agitated. He said Gato appeared to be really upset and that he started pacing back and forth in his cell as if he was starting to worry about the circumstances that he was now in. You know, of course, this was all speculation on Deputy Love's part. But again, keep in mind, this is a veteran deputy that had been working on that tier for over 4 years at that point. So whether you believed him or not, you had to give him some credibility behind the things that he was saying. So at that point, Gato had stopped trying to clean up the blood. And as he was pacing back and forth in his cell, Deputy Love told him that he needed to get him to an outside hospital because he was bleeding out. But Gato insisted that he didn't need any help. Deputy Love said that Gato was clearly reluctant to accept any help, and that this might have been predicated on the fact that Gato might have felt like it probably would have made his situation worse if he would have disappeared and walked off the tier. But ultimately, in the end, the deputies were able to wrap up Gato's arm so that he could be handcuffed in the cell and escorted out to an outside hospital. So the other telltale observation that Deputy Love would later testify about is the fact that Jojo seemed to be the only inmate on the tier whose demeanor was described as being composed and nonchalant. Unlike the other inmates who looked like they were purposely trying to hide in the back of their cells, Jojo was the only one who was sitting on his desk with his arms and legs crossed, relaxing with his feet up on the bars. He also had a smirk on his face that had guilt written all over it. When Deputy Love asked Jojo what happened to his neighbor, Jojo said, "I don't know, he must have fell." One of the most common answers that's always given or offered up in county jails and prisons across the country whenever someone gets hit or victimized. In fact, it's such a common and ridiculous answer that deputies and COs clearly understand the undertones and know exactly what it means, and that this is the only answer they're gonna get. So again, Deputy Love reiterated that Jojo said this with an air of sarcasm and a tone indicative that he didn't really care about Gato or his well-being, which probably wasn't too smart, because if you think about it, if that was his homeboy, he probably would have responded a different way. He would have showed some concern. He would have been like, what happened? What did he do? Is he all right? So at that point, based on Jojo's demeanor, the lack of interaction between Gato and the rest of the tier, and the condition of Gato's cell literally became a crime scene. The deputies knew that something had happened and that there was some type of foul play involved. But up until that point, they still didn't know what it was, and they still needed to do more investigating. So once Gato was taken to an outside hospital, they began examining his cell. And like some of the more seasoned homicide detectives would often say, if you step back and survey the intricate details of any crime scene, it'll tell you a story and give you the answers that you're looking for. So when they took a closer look at Gato's cell, they noticed that there was not only blood spatter all over the inside of Gato's cell, but there was also blood spatter on the bars and the wall between Gato and Jojo's cell as well. And that finding alone was incriminating towards Jojo. And like I said, with regards to a seasoned homicide detective being able to survey a crime scene and see a story, the blood spatter that was on the wall between Jojo and Gato's cell told a story that wasn't favorable to Jojo. So when they searched the tier, they didn't find any weapons. And later on, when Deputy Cliff would testify, he testified that when he handcuffed Jojo and he pulled him out of his cell, that Jojo reeked of freshly smelling soap and that he appeared to be really clean. You know, this observation on its own was kind of comical because, I don't know, maybe the guy was a clean freak. Maybe he just liked to be clean. There's nothing wrong with taking a bird bath. But I see what Deputy Cliff was doing, because when you consider the totality of the circumstances and how this would have corroborated their theory, that's exactly what they were doing. It basically led them to believe that Jojo was washing up and that he was also cleaning up DNA blood evidence that he might have had all over him as well. Now, here's the other thing that they took into consideration when they were evaluating the evidence, is that 1750 is considered to be a maximum security tier. These guys don't come out together, they don't have physical contact with each other, and the only time that they come out is to take a quick shower and the program for an allotted amount of time on the tier. I believe it's somewhere close to an hour. Also, on these types of tiers, compromising the locking mechanisms and inconspicuously popping the doors is something that always happens. People pop their doors open in these types of environments to get someone on the tier, and that's always a real possibility. It happens all the time. If you guys remember, I ran 2 stories on this happening a while back on 2 videos that are titled Twisted Ritual and Death Rattle. If you guys haven't seen them, scroll back and check them out. It's a pretty good example of what happens all the time. I believe they were even doing that at one time in 1750 until they came in and switched out all the locks. You know, don't quote me on this, but I believe one of my sources from a past story I ran told me this. At any rate, the evidence that was documented in this case doesn't support the theory that Jojo compromised the locking mechanism on his door, came out on the tier, and hit Gato on the tier. Even the blood spatter evidence doesn't support this. But anyways, I'm going to give you guys the backstory and tell you the details about what really happened. So everything that Deputy Love said with regard to his personal observations about both Jojo and Gato were on the money. Both of these guys were considered to be high-level Mexican Mafia associates who had worked in the capacity of tax collectors and enforcers for different Mexican Mafia members in the past. At the time, Jojo was still working under Mosca and had a direct line of contact open with him wherever he was housed at in the jail. So Jojo had landed in 1750 and then Gato would end up getting there later. You know, I'm not sure how long Jojo had been there before Gato pulled up, but either way, Jojo had clearly already established himself as the leader in 1750. And as Deputy Love had even alluded to himself, Jojo had the unequivocal respect of all the other inmates that were housed on Denver Road. However, when Gato landed there sometime later, as a showing of respect, Jojo agreed to run 1750 under the capacity of dual leadership, meaning that they'd run the tier together and under a collective consensus. Or a better description would be under the capacity of a council, like a mesa or a 2-man mesa, where they'd make decisions under a mutual consensus and only after they were both in agreement. You know, Jojo technically didn't have to do this, and he basically extended his best hand out of respect and because he wasn't a power-thirsty type of individual. You know, he also did it based on the fact that Gato had worked under several different senors before in the past, and Jojo just felt like he had earned that and that it was the right thing to do. But here's what ended up happening. When Gato landed on the tier, he was quiet, laid back, he seemed like he was disciplined, and he conducted himself like a professional. And these were all other contributing factors of why Jojo agreed to designate half of his position to Gato. But over time, Gato's true colors started to show. He became to be more arrogant, he was confrontational, he was always argumentative, he began abusing his position, and he started to make some of the other sureños on the tier feel like they were all inferior to him. All the things that you would expect from a tyrant. Eventually, he started drinking on a consistent basis, something that Jojo didn't indulge in himself, but he didn't care either way. That was Gato's business. However, it only became to be a problem later when Gato started reprimanding these guys openly on the tier and started talking to them like they were peasants. At one point, Jojo even checked Gato openly over the tier in the same fashion that Gato would do to these other guys. And Gato obviously didn't like it. But Jojo had set a standard in 1750. He was all about respect, equality, and unity. And he wasn't about to let anybody, including Gato, come in and change the program. Jojo actually probably let it go on longer than he should have. But when Gato started to contradict that standard, that's when Jojo stepped up and said, you know what, enough's enough. So it was at this point that Jojo and Gato basically both started bumping heads. And it got so bad that at one point they stopped talking. If you guys remember, Deputy Love said through his own observations, he's seen the interaction between Gato and the other inmates in 1750. And that although these guys continued to acknowledge Gato as one of their designated leaders, that they only respected him because they had to. You know, it's pretty bad when you have deputies and COs that deep in your business, when they can see these things outwardly and the tyranny is that prevalent, and that they know what leaders are respected on their own merits and who's respected out of mere obligation. At any rate, Jojo tolerated Gato and his bullshit for a while, but at one point when he got fed up with it, he reached out to Mosca and he advised him of everything that was happening. And trust me, according to my source, Mosca didn't need any encouragement. He sent word back to Jojo to go ahead and blast Gato the first chance he got. So when Jojo got the clearance to hit Gato, he didn't waste any time. He began to orchestrate a plan and put it in motion. And unbeknownst to Gato, he actually made himself an easy target, even under the circumstances of being on a max tier like 1750 with limited physical access. It was simple. Jojo had always taken notice of the fact that Gato had a habit of becoming highly animated every time he got drunk. He had a habit of not only getting loud, but he'd also be at the front of his cell sticking his arms out of his bars. You know, I've obviously never been to 1750 myself, but I'm assuming there must be bars or some other type of way for Gato to stick his arms out of his cell, because according to my source, that's exactly what he was doing. So by the time Jojo had finished fashioning a tomahawk is basically a slashing weapon that's constructed out of razor blades, and was ready to hit Gato, their interaction or lack of interaction had gotten even worse. No, Gato wasn't exercising any discretion at all when it came to the way that he was talking to some of the other guys that were back there in 1750. And him and Jojo were bumping heads so bad that they were barely even talking. In fact, it had gotten to the point where it seemed like Gato was undermining and challenging everything that Jojo would say. And the alcohol obviously only made it worse. So on January 12, 2007, Jojo put the entire tier on notice that he was going to hit Gato the first opportunity that he got. He advised everyone back there to just act normal and just continue on with their normal routines like they did every other day. And again, Jojo elected to carry this out on this specific day because he knew that Gato was going to be drinking that night. So later on that evening at about 5:20 p.m., Deputy Love had just finished doing one of his routine walks in 1750, and that's when Gato started straining his wine. In the meantime, Jojo knew that his opportunity was getting close, so he had the weapon unwrapped and he had it within arm's reach just in case he needed to grab it. This way, he could grab it and use it when Gato put himself in the right position. So at about 5:50 p.m., Gato was in the front of his cell on his bars drinking, and he was starting to get loud, just like Jojo had anticipated. And it was at this point that Jojo took up position on his bars with the tomahawk in his hand, and then he just waited. He wanted to be ready and in position when that time came. You know, Jojo never questioned whether or not he was going to be able to do this, but he also knew that he still needed a few things to work in his favor to get it done. So he used every little advantage he had to his favor. For example, in 1750, there's a one-way reflective plate glass window that runs the full length of the tier, directly across from each cell. When you're in your cell, you can use the reflection from this window to look up and down the tier and see what some of your neighbors are doing. And that's what Jojo was doing. He was watching Gato. At one point, Gato set his cup of wine down and called out to another guy that was a couple cells down. Occasionally, Gato would play chess over the tier with this other guy, and that's what he was propositioning. He wanted to play chess. But as Gato was talking to this guy, he stuck both of his arms through his bars and leaned forward, as he had often done before in the past. For Jojo, this was the perfect position that he was waiting for. From Jojo's vantage point, he could just see enough of Gato's arms to reach out through the bars and grab it, and that's exactly what he did. With the tomahawk in one hand, Jojo reached out, grabbed Gato's arm, and twisted it back so that he had it bent and extended towards his cell. Then in two fast motions, Jojo ran the tomahawk deep into Gato's arms, opening up two deep lacerations. And the razor blades that Jojo had were brand new, so they were sharp and they cut deep into Gato's arm like soft butter. It was quick, it was fast, and it was done with precision. It was done so fast that Gato didn't even try to recoil before it was done. And as soon as it happened, the tier got super quiet. Everybody knew it had happened as soon as it happened. And Jojo didn't say nothing. He just pulled back into his cell, disassembled the weapon, and flushed it. All it consisted of was a razor blade, a piece of bent cardboard, and a strand of elastic that was used to wrap around it. Jojo took it apart and flushed it because he knew that they were going to come on the tier, and there was a good chance that they were probably going to shake down the whole tier. So again, Jojo didn't say anything to Gato after he hit him, but Gato on the other hand asked Jojo why he did it, and he didn't get an answer. All he got was an entire tier that had X'd him out. Nobody said a word to him. And I'm sure that this probably upset him even more. But based on the fact that Gato had been drinking and that this obviously angered him, he made some type of loose threat towards Jojo, saying something to the effect of, "You just signed your own walking papers, boy. You're gonna have to answer for this one." But Jojo wasn't worried about it. Mosca had given him his blessings. So as far as Jojo was concerned, he had the entire backing of the Mexican Mafia behind him. So according to my source, Deputy Love came back on the tier about 20 minutes after this incident and did another routine welfare check. And this is when he walked down the tier and observed Gato behind his sheet trying to clean up the blood that was all over his cell. So from that point on, everything that Deputy Love would attest to and would later testify about at Jojo's criminal trial was accurate and pretty much happened the way that he described it. But before he came in and conducted his count, there was about 20 minutes of downtime after Jojo had hit Gato. And this is probably when reality started to sink in for Gato. Because like I said, after Gato's initial reaction where he made some type of loose threat towards Jojo, he obviously calmed down and started thinking about everything that had just happened and how ugly things could get if Jojo really pushed this issue. No, Gato, he knew that Jojo had an open line with Mosca because Jojo had previously told him. And now that the liquor was wearing off, Gato was probably starting to weigh all these things out in his mind. So after Jojo hit Gato, there was an awkward silence on the tier and nobody acknowledged or said anything to Gato. They talked amongst each other, but they basically acted like he wasn't even there. He tried to talk to Jojo and some of his other neighbors, but nobody would say anything to him, and the whole tier had completely excommunicated him. You know, I obviously don't know Gato, and I don't know what type of individual he is, but when the whole tier cut him loose and they X'd him out, I guarantee you that this was probably one of his darkest moments in his career. You know, when you fall out with certain people or you break ties with people that you've known, sometimes it doesn't even faze you. You don't even give it a second thought. But if you've been involved in this lifestyle all your life and it's all you've come to know, it hits different and you feel it. You know, like I said, Jojo and the rest of the tier continued to carry on like Gato wasn't even there. They talked over him, around him, above him, through him, and I'm sure this probably even frustrated him even more. So now fast forward to when Deputy Love came on the tier and convinced Gato to cuff up so that they could transport him to an outside hospital. After Gato was pulled out, Jojo was cuffed up and he was pulled out next. And again, as he had noted earlier, Deputy Martinez indicated that Jojo reeked of fresh bar soap. You know, I personally don't think that there was anything about this that was out of the ordinary. I just think that these deputies had a theory and they basically just ran with it. Because all this would later come out in court. And although these deputies were just trying to make it appear like this was just a bunch of small talk, they ended up using all of Jojo's statements against him at his trial. When Martinez asked Jojo why he smelled like fresh bar soap, Jojo kind of snickered and said, "Because I was dirty. I felt like taking a bird bath. Is there something wrong with that?" Martinez said, "Nah, it's just kind of odd that you and your neighbor are both in cleanup mode and he's bleeding out all over the tier." But Martinez had his fishing pole out, and as long as he continued to get answers, he kept Jojo talking. Next, he continued to press Jojo by asking him, "So what happened to Trujillo? How did he get all sliced up?" Jojo responded by saying, "I don't know, earlier we were drinking and then I don't know how it happened, but I guess he fell off his bunk." Like I said earlier, this is probably one of the most ridiculous, boneheaded things you'll hear inmates say when someone's been packed out or hit. That someone either fell off their bunk or they slipped in the shower. In county jails and prisons everywhere, it's almost like an old adage that's always said with an air of sarcasm. And everyone knows what it means. It's almost like saying, "Come on man, you know what time it is. Dude slipped on a banana peel and broke his arm. Fell on a knife, slit his own throat, and gave himself 2 black eyes." Gato, on the other hand, repeated the same thing when he was asked at the hospital what happened. So after the deputies from Operation Save Jails and other investigators that are responsible for investigating these types of in-house crimes finished their investigation, they charged Jojo with assault with a deadly weapon and custodial possession of a deadly weapon with gang allegations. 186.22, 3 10-year gang enhancements for each felony charged. They also charged him with his prior strikes and imposed an additional 25 years under the California 3 Strikes Initiative. You know, I'll go into the specifics of his sentencing in a minute, but they must have either wanted to make an example out of Jojo or they didn't like him because they ended up doing him dirty. So fast forward a couple weeks later after Jojo hit Gato in 1750. Gato ends up catching a chain to Kern Valley State Prison where he's housed in administrative segregation due to him being validated by CDCR as being an associate of the Mexican Mafia. On May 21st, 2007, Gato lands in Kern Valley and has it in his mind that the incident that took place in the county jail was a personal issue that happened between him and Jojo and that it never went beyond that. He didn't try to hide what happened either. In fact, he reported everything and tried to spin it up like it was a personal issue. As far as he was concerned, he was still active and Jojo was the one who was going to have to answer for his indiscretions. So Gato goes to his formal ICC hearing, Institutional Classification Committee, where they basically assign you to a yard that you're compatible with, classify you while you're there, and then tell you where they're going to recommend Sacramento to endorse you to. Then while you go to this hearing, before they assign you to a yard, they clearly ask you if you have any known enemies or safety concerns. Gato tells him no, that he's all good, and as a result, they assign him to the validated group yard for the Mexican Mafia, the Aryan Brotherhood, and the Nazi lowriders. You know, keep in mind, before you end up hitting a yard or even going to ICC to be assigned for a yard, you're basically on CTQ for about 10 days. If you have any kind of issues or skeletons in your past and you're kind of on the fence debating whether or not to go out there and take flight on the first individual that comes within arm's reach, or to try to go out there and program, this is the small window of time you have to figure all that out. You got about a good 10 days to put your feelers out there and see if your spidey senses can detect anything that might show you those red flags. You know, everybody's level of alertness is different, but if you've been in these types of environments before and you're polished insofar as reading your surroundings, you just got to know what to look for. Every scenario is different. It could be a break in character, the lack of eye contact or something that you might see in eye contact, something you might hear or see on the tier, or something that might be subtle, such as noticing that household business is being filtered up and down the tier and that you're purposely being skipped and left out of the loop. You know, there's a lot of different things. Sometimes these guys aren't too savvy at hiding all the outward signs. But on the other hand, you also got to be on your toes because you got some shrewd individuals that are straight chameleons. My point is, during the 10 days before Gato finally made it out to the yard, during all the interaction that he had during those 10 days, he obviously didn't see or feel anything that made him feel uncomfortable. So after his 10 days were up, they finally come around and they start releasing people for yard. He gets stripped out, they cuff him up, and then they escort him out to the yard. Later on during Jojo's trial, they had the actual yard video that shows Gato going out to the validated group yard in Kern Valley State Prison. On that particular yard, there was 9 other Mexican Mafia members and associates, and then there was 1 other Nazi lowrider. So in the video, Gato enters a small yard enclosure that leads to the main yard. he gets uncuffed, and then he's led out to the yard with everyone else. He begins going through all the customary motions of shaking hands and introducing himself to all the other inmates that are out there on the yard before they start their morning exercises. And from the initial looks of it, he's all good and appears to be embraced. So he shakes hands with about 5 different individuals before he ends up shaking hands with the guy that's only identified as Logan. And in the video, you can see that this guy Logan acts like he was getting ready to shake Gato's hand. But as they got ready to shake hands, this guy Logan snakes Gato and he takes flight on him. And then almost simultaneously at the same time, 2 other shooters join in with weapons and they begin hitting Gato. So the 3 of these guys go in on Gato until the gun tower breaks out first with the super soaker, or the water cannons equipped with pepper spray, and the 4 of them end up getting saturated. And when this fails to stop the assault, the gun tower then chambers around into the Mini 14 that's easily heard by everybody out there on the yard. And obviously nobody was trying to get shot that day because that was enough to stop them. But here's the crazy thing about the incident that probably had more of a prejudicial effect on the jury than anything. On the videotape of this incident that was played for the jury, you can actually see a weapon protruding from Gato's back. It was left stuck there and it was buried up into the makeshift handle. I don't know if it was done purposely for effect or if it ended up just slipping out of someone's hand, but it was there. So in the video, everyone's proned out, and since Gato was identified as being the victim, he's the first one told to walk to the gate. And as he's walking to the gate, one of the other Mexican Mafia members or associates gets up, runs over to Gato, and pulls the knife out of his back and throws it towards one of the fences. You know, in the end, when all was said and done, Gato agreed to testify in Jojo's trial as part of his defense. He basically went in there and downplayed Jojo's culpability and said that he didn't have anything to do with the 2 cuts on his arm. In fact, he even testified that him and Jojo were good friends and that Jojo was a swell guy. When they asked Gato if Jojo was a violent individual or if he was a shot caller, Gato answered some crazy kind of way by saying, "Oh heavens no." A very likable guy, and we had a very professional relationship. It was almost over the top. No, needless to say, I don't know what kind of impression Gato was under, if he believed that he was going to be back in good standings by trying to help Jojo. But if that's what he thought, he definitely went for the banana in the tailpipe. Anyways, besides the blood spatter between Gato and Jojo's cell and all the other evidence that they used to give credence to their theory that Jojo basically grabbed Gato's arm and sliced him through the bars, they also used 2 kites that they found in the cell of a guy named David Steinberg. This guy was neighbors with Mosca in another part of the LA County jail, and from the sounds of it, I'd be willing to bet that this was probably Mosca's secretary and the guy that he had facilitating all of his communications. So the 2 kites didn't have anything to do with the assault, but they were damaging based on the fact that it showed that Jojo was directly under Mosca and that Mosca had given him his authority. So they also had 2 other gang investigators that came in and testified as gang experts at Jojo's trial. One of them being Special Agent David Evanilla, who's commonly known to be the type of gang investigator that will go the extra mile to get you. So Jojo and his attorney had their hands full when they took this case to trial. So like I said, besides being a Mexican Mafia associate and someone who was clearly working as a tax collector and a Mexican Mafia enforcer on the street, I don't know anything else about Jojo's history. But for whatever reason, the DA wanted to send Jojo up the river, and he did. The jury came back with guilty verdicts across the board. He got slammed on every count. And then later on when they took him to sentencing, they didn't cut him any breaks either. So get this. He was sentenced to a term of 50 years plus 44 years to life in state prison. On the custodial possession of a deadly weapon, the trial court imposed a term of 25 years to life. They also found him guilty of a crime committed for the benefit of a criminal street gang, plus an additional 10 years for the gang enhancement. So they gave him 44 years plus an additional 50 years to life on top of another 20 years for 2 gang enhancements. Then the judge also sentenced him to 25 years to life on the assault with a deadly weapon count, plus an additional 10 years for the 186.22, the gang enhancement. Are you following me? Hold on, I'm not done yet. They also gave him 3 years for his prison priors, on top of another 25 years to life for being a 3-striker, with one more complimentary 186.22, a gang enhancement. In case you lost count, don't trip, I got you. So whether it was a coincidence or just another stroke of bad luck for Jojo, his final number ended up being 187 years to life, the penal code for a homicide. Anyways, there's a lot that I could say about this case and the way that Jojo was railroaded, but I'm just gonna keep this one simple. I said it 1,000 times, 1,000 different ways, and I'll say it again. And I'll keep saying it, hoping that there's at least one of you out there that will eventually hear me. No matter how you slice it and dice it, there is no winners at the end of this game. At least not for those of you who one day want to take your life in a different direction. You know, it used to be fun when you used to be able to catch multiple 16 2-and-3s. Do a few years, come back home, and then go back on vacation, and then do it again. But it's not like that anymore. The rules have changed. They're wiping people out now, and they're doing what they did to Jojo. It's called stacking, and it goes well above and beyond what I talked about in this story. This is just a part of it. The bigger and more sinister picture is what's happening right now everywhere around you. I mean, seriously, just take a step back and look at everything that's going on in this world right now. Not just in the criminal element or in prison, but in this world, everywhere. People aren't playing by the rules anymore, and nobody's doing nothing about it. You know, this should terrify some of you. The game has gotten so dirty and corrupt that you don't even have to be breaking the law nowadays in order for you to get snatched up and sent halfway across the world. You know, there's a lot of crazy things going on in this world right now that should make people want to change their perspectives and the way that they move. Before, there used to be checks and balances because you had to play by the rules and you had certain protections. Not anymore. Who are you going to appeal to when nobody's listening and people just don't have the backbone to stand up anymore and do what's right? You know, I know it sounds like I'm probably just rambling and talking in circles, but I'm really not. There's a very clear underlying message, and I just hope that some of you understand what it is I'm trying to say. Anyways, I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. If you guys liked this episode, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like this episode, give it a thumbs down. But either way, drop a comment and let me know what you think. And again, something else that's important that I'm going to continue to keep reminding you guys about is to not only hit the like, drop a comment, and share the video, but also hit the all symbol on the notification bell so that you're notified anytime I drop content on this channel. So with that being said, as always, I just want to thank those of you who continue to show your unwavering loyalty and those of you who also continue to keep tapping into the channel. In the meantime, you guys enjoy the rest of your day. Keep pushing that positivity. And until the next one, this is your boy B, and I'm gone.